By 1960, roughly 17 million black Americans lived under a legal architecture designed to humiliate and exclude them. Segregated schools, segregated lunch counters, poll taxes, literacy tests administered selectively to suppress black voter registration across the South. This was not the remnant of an older era reluctantly persisting. It was actively enforced, often by state and local governments, and tacitly accepted in federal policy for decades. What changed in 1960 was not the law. It was the decision, made by young people in particular, that waiting was no longer a strategy. 4 black college students sat down at a Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, in February of that year, and the modern civil rights movement shifted into a gear it had never quite found before. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, formed in April 1960, brought a new and impatient energy to the movement alongside the older Southern Christian Leadership Conference. These were people in their late teens and early 20s, many of them willing to absorb violence without retaliating, not out of passivity, but out of a calculated understanding that moral clarity required it. The Freedom Rides of 1961 tested that commitment in the most brutal way possible. Integrated buses traveling through Alabama were firebombed near Anniston and attacked by mobs in Birmingham and Montgomery, while law enforcement stood aside. Attorney General Robert Kennedy privately urged a cooling-off period. The Freedom Riders refused. Far away from those burning buses, a different kind of American commitment was deepening in Southeast Asia. The United States had been sending military advisors to South Vietnam since the mid-1950s, propping up a government in Saigon that was struggling against a communist insurgency backed by North Vietnam. President Kennedy inherited this arrangement and expanded it. By late 1963, there were more than 16,000 American military advisors in South Vietnam. Kennedy's actual intentions about escalation remain genuinely debated by historians, but before any decision could be made, he was assassinated in Dallas on November 22, 1963, and Lyndon Johnson inherited both the war and the question. Back in the United States, the summer of 1963 had produced the most galvanizing public moment the civil rights movement had yet seen. The March on Washington in August, where more than 200,000 people gathered around the reflecting pool on the National Mall. Martin Luther King Jr. delivered a speech that moved the country and embarrassed the government simultaneously, making the contradiction between American rhetoric and American reality impossible to ignore on a global stage during the Cold War. President Kennedy had been reluctant and slow on civil rights legislation. The march applied pressure that could not be dismissed. But King also knew, and said privately, that a speech was not a law, and a law was still what was needed. Lyndon Johnson, the Texas Democrat who had spent decades mastering Senate procedure, used the grief and shock following Kennedy's assassination to push the Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Congress, breaking a Senate filibuster that lasted more than 60 days, the longest in Senate history to that point. The act outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin in public accommodations and employment. It was a legal transformation of enormous significance, and Johnson knew the political cost. He reportedly told an aide that signing it meant Democrats had lost the South for a generation. He was not wrong, but a second crisis was already building that would devour Johnson's presidency entirely. In August 1964, the Johnson administration reported that North Vietnamese torpedo boats had attacked U.S. Navy destroyers in the Gulf of Tonkin, first on August 2nd, and then, allegedly, again on August 4th. Congress responded by passing the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson broad authority to escalate military operations in Vietnam without a formal declaration of war. The August 2nd incident occurred. The August 4th incident almost certainly did not, a fact that became clear only years later. On the basis of a reported attack that likely never happened, the United States committed to a war that would cost more than 58,000 American lives and hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese lives. The number they relied on didn't match what actually happened in that water, and the consequences are still unfolding. By 1965, 2 seismic events occurred within months of each other, pulling the country along its fault lines. In March, state troopers on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, beat peaceful marchers with clubs and used tear gas as the nation watched on television. Bloody Sunday shocked enough of the public and enough of Congress to produce the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which targeted the specific mechanisms used to disenfranchise black voters in the South. 5 months later, American combat troops were landing in Vietnam in large numbers. The draft was expanding, and Johnson was committing to a ground war in Asia with no clear exit strategy. The Great Society and the war in Southeast Asia were now on a collision course for the same federal budget. The war ground on, and trust ground down with it. By 1967, more than 400,000 American troops were in Vietnam, casualties were climbing, and military briefings that promised progress diverged visibly from what journalists were reporting from the field. The credibility gap, the distance between official statements and observable reality, began eating at public support in a way that no single battle could explain. Then in January 1968 came the Tet Offensive. Coordinated surprise attacks by North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces on more than 100 towns and cities in South Vietnam, including the U.S. Embassy compound in Saigon. Militarily, it was repelled. Psychologically, it broke something. If the enemy could do this, what had 4 years of escalation actually achieved? 1968 became the year the decade's contradictions detonated all at once. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in Memphis on April 4th. Cities burned in grief and fury across the country within days. Robert Kennedy, running for president on a platform of ending the war and expanding the Great Society, was assassinated in Los Angeles on June 5th, the night he won the California primary. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in August, police beat anti-war protesters in the streets while the party tore itself apart inside. Johnson had already announced he would not seek re-election. Richard Nixon won the presidency in November on a promise of peace and order, the exact terms that the decade had failed to deliver. What the 1960s actually produced was not the resolution most commemorations suggest. It was a permanent restructuring of American political identity, with the fault lines still visible today. The Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act transformed the legal landscape in ways that mattered enormously and concretely for millions of people. Those gains were real. But the political coalition that made them possible fractured under the weight of Vietnam, urban unrest, and a backlash that Nixon understood and exploited. The deeper truth the decade reveals about America is not that it found its conscience, but that it discovered conscience and its limits at the same moment, and that the argument over which would govern has never stopped.